And I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And since we are meeting virtually, I also hope we can take a moment to each acknowledge for ourselves the specific lands, histories, and locations we are each coming from, and to also reflect on what it is that drew us here today and how those two pieces, where we are coming from and where we want to go, might connect. Having just marked our first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, I suspect this might be something on people's minds, at least for those of us here in Canada. And so I hope we can keep these reflections in our hearts and minds as we listen today and hopefully discuss. I just want to let you know about the Q&A procedures. There will be opportunities for questions both during and after the presentation, so please note that if you choose to participate during the presentation, you may also be recorded. That said, the Q&A at the end of the presentation will not be recorded, so please use the chat function or the raise hand function. And to make the event more accessible to everyone, we have also enabled the closed captioning feature in Zoom for those who might require it. Just want to check if there are any questions at this point. Please do put it in the chat, and maybe Nancy can speak up if she sees any. I can't see everybody right now. I would also like to begin by thanking our co-sponsors and organizers of this event. First and foremost, the Centre for Migration Studies at the University of British Columbia. I invite you to please follow UBC Migration on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is up on the PowerPoint slide and is at UBC Migration. This presentation was also co-sponsored by UBC Migration's Community University Partnerships Working Group, which aims to develop strong collaborative partnerships between the UBC Centre for Migration Studies, academic and community members. An earlier talk, I think, was postponed, so this is actually the first in the whole series of virtual talks being organized by the Centre's various working groups, and it is the first among the talks specifically related to using arts-based approaches in community-based or community-engaged migration research. And it was organized by the Community University Partnerships Group specifically. Specifically, it was organized by Dr. Suzanne Hewitt from the UBC Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy, and Dr. Nancy Clark from the Faculty of Human and Social Development and the School of Nursing at the University of Victoria. And Dr. Clark will be monitoring the Q&A both during and following the presentation. So I think, unless there are any other questions, I will just introduce our speaker. So our speaker is Dr. Caroline Lenette, whose talk for us today asks, are participatory arts-based methods culturally safe? Assistant Professor Caroline Lenette teaches qualitative research methods and policy analysis courses in the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. She is an internationally renowned scholar on participatory research and the ethics of co-design and co-production. Caroline has over 16 years experience collaborating with refugee background co-researchers on topics such as mental health and well-being, gender equity issues, human rights, and access to higher education, how to influence policymaking via knowledge translation plans. She has written 2 sole-authored books on participatory methodologies, published 8 book chapters and 55 peer-reviewed articles in well-read and high-impact journals across disciplines on topics such as qualitative research, health, social work, refugee issues, and education. And I would like to add that in the few times I have interacted with Professor Lenette, she has been extremely generous with her time and knowledge. And she was most especially gracious when we discovered the time zone discrepancy in the advertising for this talk. And for this, we are extremely grateful. And she also has shared with us in advance of this talk, a digital copy of her 2019 book called Artsbased Methods in Refugee Research, Creating Sanctuary. So if anyone is interested in accessing a copy, please let us know. And I will turn this over to Professor Lenette right now, and I can put my email address into the chat if anyone would like to request a copy.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And thank you to the Centre for Migration Studies and the co-sponsor for inviting me to this talk and for organising it at a time that's accessible for us here in Australia. And I'm pleased to be part of this workshop series and to know that it's now the first one to kick off what I'm sure is a wonderful lineup of interesting discussions. I'm joining you today from unceded Bedigal land, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land where I live, work and play, the Bedigal people of the Eora Nation. As an uninvited migrant settler, I would like to acknowledge the benefits that accrue to me by living on unceded Aboriginal land. The violence that was used to take this land continues today, and sovereignty was never ceded, and the struggle of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is ongoing. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to express my support for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The conversation about when would be a good time for me to travel to Vancouver began early last year. And at the time, my main concern was to avoid the Canadian winter and to reduce my carbon footprint. How things have changed since then. I'm in week 15 of a lockdown due to ease next Monday. But I'd like to acknowledge the difficulties and losses that many of you might have experienced due to the pandemic. It is timely to focus this workshop on whether our approach to participatory research is culturally safe, given their growing use in migration studies and other disciplines. I do hope that you've already considered the question in the context of your own research. And I'm really excited to hear your thoughts about the topic today. So my plan is to ask you to share some of those thoughts in the chat at different points so that your contributions are recorded, but I'm also happy for you to wait for the Q&A. So I'll share my thoughts on the topic, and my aim is to open up the conversation and push you to think critically about your research approach from a decolonial lens. And I want to thank Natasha for the wonderful acknowledgement of country and the sad time that characterizes the discussions in Canada and in Australia as well on those issues. So in the first part, I'll highlight the importance of reflexivity and a decolonial lens or decolonial methods. The second point I'll speak about is knowing the origins of your methods. And the final very brief section is about teaching research methods. Before I do this, I'd like to share an anecdote on why I'm interested in this question. So to give you a bit of background about me, I completed my tertiary studies in Australia between 2000 and 2011, first as a temporary guest or international student, and then as a migrant. My studies had an applied focus and were skills-based, so I can't say that I had much opportunity to deconstruct, let alone challenge or disrupt how knowledge and research methodologies were conceptualized. It wasn't until I attended a conference in Cape Town, South Africa in 2016 that my thinking began changing. It was a conference on ethnography, and one of the keynote speakers was Dr. Nolwazi Mukwanazi. For me, it was the first time I was listening to a Black woman as a keynote speaker. She shared that her fourth-year students had never read anything from Black scholars before joining her class. Her reflection troubled me because of what it meant for me as a Black person who'd studied in a white majority country. I wondered whether I had read any Black scholars throughout all those years of tertiary education, and I could not think of any course where I had been exposed to Black or decolonial scholarship. In short, I wasn't told that I should learn beyond white scholars or given examples of books I should consult. So the first question I'd like you to think about is, who are you reading and who are you citing? I did come across Black and decolonial scholarship, but I did not know it at the time. So what I mean is my coming across Frantz Fanon and Arundhati Roy was purely accidental. I found their books interesting, but I did not think critically about how their writing could inform my understanding of the world and challenge the white education I was receiving. So I want to pause here for a minute or two to ask you to share in the chat if you wish, or you can email me or tweet about it, but I'd like you to share what books or which authors made you realize you were receiving a white education and changed the course of your thinking. So I'll stop here for a minute to give you a chance to add your contribution to the chat if you wish to. Harsha Walia, Sarah Ahmed, wonderful. Aftab Bra, Gayatri Spivak, Eve Tuck, Decolonization is not a metaphor article. Sean Wilson, Adrian Rich, Bell Hooks, yes. Linda Tuiway-Smith, Tendai Ashumi, Aileen Morton Robinson, Kimberly Crenshaw, Archibald on story work, Patricia Hill Collins, thank you very much for these contributions. They're all fascinating authors. George Sefardai, thank you, Suzanne. This will be a fantastic record of where people who listen to the talk can go to start reading Black scholarship. So thank you very much for that. Okay. So in my first book, Artsbased Methods in Refugee Research, which was published a couple of years ago, as Natasha mentioned, I discuss cultural safety in research in chapter 1, and I occasionally mention the importance of decolonizing research and methods throughout. Cultural safety was first discussed in the 1990s in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in relation to Maori nursing students' experiences of racism in transcultural nursing. But what does cultural safety in research refer to? So for me, cultural safety poses the question, how do co-researchers feel about their engagement and the research process and about the content explored? So when a research relationship is culturally safe, co-researchers' perspectives about project design, implementation, evaluation, and dissemination, and the research team are central, not peripheral concerns. And co-researchers are confident that they can contribute their perspectives without fear of being misunderstood or diminished, and that their narratives will be respected and recognized to their just value. But when I wrote this, I didn't have a clear sense of what I meant, because I hadn't gone through the trouble of explaining why there is a need to decolonize research in the first place, how to do it, and how our use of research methods in culturally safe ways directly relates to the decolonization agenda. So even though I'm very proud of this book, and I would encourage you to have a look at it, it wasn't until I wrote my second book, which is on participatory action research, and it doesn't have a cover yet, that I dedicated space to explicitly stating those issues. I've included the word decolonization in the title so that anyone who comes across this book approaches it with that lens and is prepared to go back to the basics about the need to decolonize research and the academy. In case you're wondering, the book is in production and should be published early next year. So the second question I'd like you to think about is, what is the role of reflexivity when using participatory arts-based methods in diverse, complex settings, as is usually the case in migration studies? By reflexivity, I mean how we as researchers consciously reflect on who we are, what assumptions we bring to the research, and how these influence and shape relationships, processes, and outcomes. While you think about this question, it's important to note that, one, stating your positionality alone does not equate to being an ethical researcher if you do not have the capacity to be reflexive. Two, no research method, participatory or not, is culturally safe in and of itself. And three, we all have the potential to use methods in culturally unsafe ways because of our privileges and a lack of reflexivity. So good intentions alone don't equate to good processes or practices. Without an explicit commitment to identifying how our identities and privileges shape our research, our choice of methodology, and who we collaborate with, we risk reinforcing rather than challenging colonialist-infused research methodologies in migration studies. I'd like to read an extract from the preface of my book on PAR. The starting point was a reaction to Professor Alison Phipps' excellent book, Decolonizing Multilingualism, Struggles to Decreate. Quote, "The word Alison used in her book title, Decreate, was the source of discomfort. I sat with this pebble in my shoe feeling for a few weeks. Had I done enough to decreate in my 10-year career? I questioned my own commitment to decolonization and my positionality. As a first-generation migrant with English as a second language, a woman with brown skin, making me a visible minority in a white majority country stolen from Indigenous people, and a sole parent, I have many career achievements despite the sexism, racism, ageism, culture of hyperproductivity, and unrealistic demands of academia. Upon reflection, I began to see my survival strategy more clearly. I had worked hard to become white men. Academic institutions are built to white men's image, not mine. While seeking white men's privileges, I had adopted colonial practices that sustain elitism and racism, such as teaching research methods from a white privileged perspective and imposing institutions' bureaucratic structures onto community partners from diverse backgrounds," unquote. So I'd encourage you to think about your own trajectory and what has shaped it, and to discuss your thoughts with similar-minded people. Recently, I completed a project with Professor Catherine Boydell, who hails from Canada. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Catherine's work on arts-based research and mental health. We use story completion to ask Australian residents to express their thoughts, fears, and experiences in response to a hypothetical scenario or a STEM on the impact of COVID-19. Story completion is what I would call a non-participatory method, but our aim was to find and use a suitable online creative writing tool. When we set out to write up the findings and reflect on the lack of diversity among participants, we realized that we hadn't considered whether story completion was a culturally safe method. We decided to write a separate paper on this topic, and we outlined a different approach to story completion that includes exploring diverse notions of storytelling, for example, from Indigenous, African, Latin American, Middle Eastern, Pacifica, or Asian literature and norms to inform the STEM design, to adapt story completion to diverse sociocultural contexts, to challenge Western narrative arcs, and to co-create the story STEM. In that process, I went back to the literature on decolonizing methodologies, and Indigenous scholars' writing is extremely useful to challenge methodological assumptions. And some of you have already mentioned Linda Tuiwei-Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies as a fantastic example. Linda is speaking at the University of York next Wednesday. So if you're interested to hear more from her, I think that would be a great workshop to join. However, we do need more published research on how we can decolonize methods. And I'm going to provide 3 examples of what I mean by decolonizing methods. The first one is Michelle Dixon's work using photo yarning, where yarning is an Aboriginal norm and respected practice for exchanging knowledge and sharing stories. She explained that yarning around photographs using culturally appropriate processes yielded rich data that may have taken months to obtain using interviews alone. The approach was successful because it adapted the standard method of photo voice to fit the context and backgrounds of co-researchers and of the researcher, rather than assume that simply asking co-researchers to take photographs and talk about them would achieve its emancipatory aims. The second example is Lisa Williams and colleagues' work in Aotearoa, where Maori cultural protocols were integrated in digital storytelling projects on Indigenous palliative caregiving. Kaupapa Maori research makes Maori concerns and priorities the focal point of research that is centered within Maori culture and practice. The third example relates to quantitative methods, and I had never considered how quant methods can be decolonized. I posted a tweet a couple of months ago asking how researchers assess whether methods are culturally safe. And Dr. Helen Cara, who is a creative research methods guru, shared this excellent example, namely Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson's book on Indigenous statistics. Their work aimed to challenge established deficit-based practices of Indigenous statistics in favour of a new paradigm for quantitative research, such as Nairi Caddy or good numbers. Being informed by Indigenous standpoints in quantitative research leads to asking different questions and analysing data differently. So getting back to the question for this workshop, it becomes clear that without engaging in an explicit and deliberate exploration of how a method is used in a culturally safe way, and without attention to researcher reflexivity, there are many ways that participatory arts-based methods can be used in culturally unsafe ways. So for example, more and more researchers use photography as an interesting and creative approach, especially with children and young people. But there's very limited understanding of researchers' reflexive processes because they are either non-existent or left out of research publications or accounts. So there's no guarantee that researchers have taken care to fully explore who they are, how they understand the people they collaborate with, and how they ensure that power differentials, institutional racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, transphobia, and homophobia are not influencing the research process. Using photography as a research method cannot achieve those aims unless there is a thoughtful, deliberate process to identify preconceived notions, a process that many researchers are not prepared to undertake because it might be uncomfortable. So even though the literature on participatory arts-based methods is expanding, whenever journals ask me to review manuscripts on the topic, I've noted that there is still very little discussion about ethical issues, positionality, and reflexivity. For me, this is a missed opportunity to provide candid reflections about the complexities of the field, as well as best practices to ensure that co-researchers do not end up worse off because of our research. So I'd like to pause here again to ask you to share in the chat if you wish, or share more broadly after the talk. What piece of reflexive writing are you most proud of in terms of detailing ethical issues and dilemmas and clearly outlining your positionality? So I'm really keen for you to share this in the chat so that others can also consult your work where you've paid careful attention to those issues. Perhaps we'll leave that discussion for the Q&A, and that's okay. Oh, we have one in the chat. Nancy, thank you. Nancy Clark's project summary exploring Syrian men's mental health and participation in labour employment, a community participatory arts-based project. That sounds fantastic, Nancy. Charisma, lovely to see you. A recently accepted paper in Gender, Place and Culture entitled Research Ethics with Vulnerable Groups, Ethics in Practice and Procedure. I can't wait for this to be out and I will cite it furiously. Susan, thank you. Context, Communication and Paradox on Learning Not to Ask Overly Sensitive Questions. So that's a book chapter, thank you. Erin, the Worn Words Project, Narrative Mobilization, Refugee Discourse and Digital Media Production. In the Narrative Methods in Ethics in Forced Migration Research, also an edited collection. That sounds fantastic. Lois Klassen, a letter of Agnes McCausland Richardson Etherington, Unsettling Settler Canadian Nation Building. So that's a book. A theme journal, fantastic, looks really interesting in press. Great, cannot wait to see all of these being accessible. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. So I'll move on now to the second point, which was to consider when discussing participatory arts-based methods, is to know where our methods come from. In the case of story completion that I mentioned before, the method is grounded in Western psychology and psychotherapy, which clearly indicates the need to unpack these origins and identify what aspect of the method could be culturally unsafe. So do you know the origins of the methods you use in migration research and other disciplines? Emily Polk wrote an excellent paper that explored the Western underpinnings of digital storytelling and the suitability of using this method in culturally diverse communities. Her work was published in 2010 at a time when digital storytelling projects were booming in the community and in disciplines such as health, education, and disability studies. So it was a very good point to reflect on the origins of that method. For other arts-based methods, such as participatory filmmaking, it is possible to draw on scholarship and cross-cultural analysis from other disciplines, such as Sissy Health's work on critical representations of refugees in documentaries. But there is a long list of methods that fall under the umbrella term of participatory arts-based methods. And it's not always clear whether there have been robust discussions about the origins of each method and how these determine whether they can be used in culturally safe ways. This is a specific problem in migration studies, which has an enduring tradition of applying methods indiscriminately, and where most scholars are still Western researchers who haven't experienced migration or forced migration, and who have a very limited understanding of intersectionality. I would suggest that for each method you decide to use, it is crucial that you first find out what principles and ideologies influence and shape it, and what changes should be implemented before using these methods in culturally safe ways. So this is part of our responsibilities as researchers. In another example, I used walking interviews in a project called Finding Home. That was a SSHRC-funded project, which explored meanings attached to home in collaboration with 3 refugee background women co-researchers originally from Iraq. By walking along familiar routes in their neighborhood, we learned about the women's stories of homemaking. The focus on place lent itself to a sensory mobile method and yielded rich data. With Josie Gardner, the research assistant on the project, we consciously chose a small group of co-researchers to co-create narrative on homemaking. If you'd like to know more about how to get started with this method, we outline pre-walk and practical considerations in our paper in the journal Field Methods. During the one-on-one walks, the women decided where to go, what to talk about, how long to walk for, what to photograph, and what to record as soundscapes of the different sites. I made short clips of the walks using these photographs and soundscapes, and I'd like to show you an example now. Apologies to everyone that the sound was not on, but please know that on the Project Finding Home website, you can see the video and you can watch it with the sound on. And the sound is the soundscapes that was recorded during Nadal's walk. So you will have the opportunity of watching the clip as a more immersive experience. So I want to point out an important pre-walk consideration from this project. Before we invited the women to engage in walking interviews, Josie and I had several discussions about the method and how to explain it to potential co-researchers. We also discussed what wording we should use to give them a good sense of what they should expect and how the interviews would take place. And more importantly, how we would ensure that the co-researchers would lead these activities, these interviews. So our discussions meant that we had to anticipate how the method might be perceived and how we would tackle issues linked to privacy, confidentiality, cultural safety, as well as mobility and language issues. Walking interviews has been used mainly in health research and geography, but we're now seeing examples from disability studies and planning. But as I anticipated, there was very little information about prioritizing cultural safety when using this method. So through our reflexive conversations before we started the research, as well as during and at the completion of the project, we remained aware of how we would support this co-research model in a way that made sense to the women involved. What we decided is that we would not impose a preconceived notion of how to implement walking interviews, and this was negotiated with each woman. Josie and I are migrant background women, and we were mindful to suspend our own conceptualization of the meaning of home and what kinds of conversations we should have about homemaking. In my forthcoming book, I describe PAR as a decolonial intersectional tool. Because PAR has been taken up widely in Western English-speaking research contexts and scholarship, the origins of PAR, grounded in reflexive research practice and debates in majority world settings, or what some call the Global South, are often forgotten. This erasure or whitewashing of PAR's roots highlights how Western academic settings can continue to reproduce colonial relations in research over time and across place. But it is precisely because of its origins in the majority world that PAR has huge potential as a decolonial intersectional approach. The term participation is one that I thought I understood well before I had to write about it in detail. And struggling with the writing process has confirmed that I'm keen to push for more explorations about the challenging aspects of participatory methods, the politics of research, the limitations of methodologies, and the intricacies of applying participatory principles in research. I think that it's so important that we all commit to or continue doing this, to share and publish realistic and comprehensive discussions on the strengths as well as difficulties of upholding participatory approaches, to show that good research can be and is usually complex. I want to finish by briefly discussing teaching research methods. I've taught qualitative research methods from first-year undergraduate to postgrad students, and I've supervised honours, masters, and PhD candidates. I've outlined here what I think are some of the key challenges and opportunities of integrating the principles of decolonial and culturally safe research approaches in our teaching. In terms of challenges, the main issue for me is that courses are largely based on Western epistemologies, and this determines how we teach about writing a good research question, conducting a literature review, and collecting and analysing data. There's usually little time and space to challenge students' understanding of privileges and positionalities in research contexts. In my case, I have to teach research courses over 9-week terms. And unfortunately, participatory methods often don't make it into the curriculum for generic research methods courses. When there are separate courses on decolonizing research methods, they tend to be conceptual rather than applied, which is fine, except that students don't always know how to apply those principles in practice. But there's also much to look forward to. I enjoy the responsibility of being the first person to introduce new students to research methodologies, and I find that they're keen to understand how to interact in a complex world in new ways. Research students are great to work with because they take on board the possibilities and potentialities of participatory methods, of using a decolonial lens, of questioning their positionalities and privileges, and of citing scholars beyond the usual suspects, to quote Alison Phipps. I'm also heartened by the growing number of scholars who explicitly challenge our harmful ways of doing research because of their diverse and intersectional backgrounds and lived experiences. I think there's a clear role for those of us who teach research methods to integrate principles of cultural safety, intersectionality, and decoloniality from the first year of study. I do hope that at least some of what I've said has resonated with you and makes you want to question yourself and challenge others. Cultural safety in research is everyone's responsibility, and I very much look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Thank you very much.